They told me it was routine, like the kind of thing you schedule between emails and grocery runs, and I acted like I believed them so completely that I even made jokes while I signed the last form. And I remember thinking that I was being mature about it, being the kind of woman who didn't need anyone to fuss, the kind of woman who could handle discomfort and bounce back with a smile. Then, a few hours later, the alarm started. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it look, with one clear moment where everything turns and you get a neat sentence to explain it, because it happened like slipping on a wet floor you didn't see, with the room tilting and voices getting sharper and faster, while my body went strangely quiet, like it was stepping away from me. And I tried to keep my face steady because that was my habit, to look fine even when I wasn't. The pressure cuff squeezed and squeezed again, too tight, too often, and a nurse asked me questions that felt simple but suddenly hard to answer, like my brain was moving through syrup and I could hear the wheels of a cart, the rustle of packaging, the clipped rhythm of shoes on hospital linoleum, and I realized I couldn't tell if I was cold or sweating or both. Somewhere in that blur, I remember thinking, with this calm disbelief that still makes my throat tighten, that this cannot be how it ends. Not like this, not after something I treated like an errand. And when I finally surfaced again, later, in a different kind of quiet, the first thing I noticed wasn't the pain or the tube in my throat or the weight of my own breathing. It was the empty chair. Just picture that for a moment, because the machines were there, the staff was there, the steady blinking numbers were there, and yet the space where a person should have been felt louder than all of it, and my mind kept circling one thought like it was trying to solve a puzzle. Where was my family? Before all of that, my life looked clean from the outside, the kind of life people describe with words like capable and put together, because I kept my bills paid, my apartment organized, my calendar color-coded, and my problems handled quietly, like I could tuck anything uncomfortable into a drawer and still make it to work on time. I was 37, single, no kids, and I wore independence the way some people wear perfume, lightly but on purpose, because I'd learned early that needing things from people could come with strings, opinions, and the kind of disappointment that sticks to your ribs. So I became low maintenance, the way you become fluent in a language you didn't choose. My family existed in my phone more than in my living room, and I told myself that was fine, because we weren't estranged in the dramatic sense. We were just spaced out, like furniture you stop noticing because it's always been there, and I played my part in that distance with practiced ease. If someone asked how I was doing, I said I was good. If someone offered help, I said I was fine. If a conversation drifted toward feelings or needs or anything that might require a pause, I redirected it the way I redirected everything else in my life. Back to logistics, back to facts, back to something I could control. And for months, my body had been sending me small, boring warnings that I treated like background noise. A tightness after meals, a nausea that came and went, a sharp little pinch under my ribs that made me inhale carefully for a second, then continue cooking, continue working, continue answering messages, because I had this stubborn pride in pushing through, in not being the person who made a big deal out of discomfort. Have you ever done that? Told yourself something wasn't serious simply because you didn't have time for it to be serious? When the doctor finally said gallbladder surgery, the word routine wrapped around it like a blanket, and I grabbed that blanket with both hands, because routine meant safe, and safe meant I didn't have to inconvenience anyone, and inconvenience, in my world, was dangerously close to vulnerability. So I scheduled it like an appointment. I told my boss I'd be out briefly. I stocked my fridge with easy food. I cleaned my apartment like I was going on a short trip. And I didn't ask anyone to come, because in my head I wasn't avoiding love. I was being considerate. I was being strong. I was being the version of myself I'd always been. I had no idea that my definition of strength was about to be tested in the most humiliating way. In the week leading up to surgery, my body felt like it was trying to speak a little louder, and I kept turning the volume down, because denial isn't always dramatic, and sometimes it's just the decision to keep moving while something inside you keeps raising its hand. I noticed how careful I'd become around food, how I'd scan a menu and automatically avoid anything greasy, how I'd sip water slowly as if speed alone could trigger pain, and I told myself it was stress, or age, or my schedule, because those explanations let me stay in charge, and being in charge was the only thing that kept me calm. The night before the procedure, I lay in bed and tried to feel normal, But my thoughts kept hopping from one practical detail to another like they were afraid to land. And I remember staring at the ceiling and thinking about how weird it was that I could be scared and still refuse to say the word scared out loud. Even with family, I kept it light. I sent a group text that sounded casual, almost playful, something like me mentioning that I'd be in and out, and that I'd be back on my feet fast, because that was the persona I'd built over years, the woman who didn't need a rescue, the woman who didn't create emergencies, the woman who made other people comfortable by pretending nothing ever shook her. And that's the part one didn't understand until later. I thought I was protecting myself from disappointment, but I was also training people on how to treat me. If you tell everyone you're fine long enough, they start to believe you so deeply that they stop checking. On the morning of surgery, the hospital smelled like sanitizer and coffee and something faintly metallic, and the waiting area had that forced calm that never feels real, because everyone is pretending their hands aren't sweating, and I sat there scrolling through my phone, answering work messages like that proved I was still in control. A nurse called my name and walked me back through hallways that looked identical, and I remember the soft squeak of my socks on the floor, the way the paper gown clung to my thighs, the chill that seeped through it, and the fact that nobody was walking beside me, because I hadn't asked anyone to. They put an IV in my arm, taped it down, and told me to breathe normally, and I did, because I wanted to be the easiest patient they had all day, and I remember thinking, almost proudly, that I was handling this like an adult. Then the anesthesiologist spoke to me in a practiced, reassuring tone, and I nodded along. And the last clear moment I have before everything slid away was a nurse adjusting the blanket over my legs with a quick, kind efficiency. The next stretch of time is hard to describe, because it wasn't a dream, and it wasn't nothing, and it wasn't the clean blackout I expected. It was fragments. A voice saying my name like it mattered. A beep repeating with a stubborn patience. A sensation of heaviness in my chest, like the air had thickened. And under it all, a strange inner whisper that kept asking a question my mind didn't want to answer. What if this isn't routine? Try to put yourself there with me for a second, because it's one thing to be brave when you believe the script, and it's another thing entirely when your body starts improvising and you realize you don't know how the scene ends. Somewhere in that half-awareness, I felt urgency around me, felt hands moving faster, felt someone pressing something down, and I couldn't lift my head or open my eyes properly, but I could sense the shift in the room, that invisible change when professionals stop being relaxed and start being precise. And in the middle of it, in the most surreal way, my mind didn't go to dramatic thoughts about death or legacy. It went to something smaller and sharper. It went to the empty chair I hadn't thought about yet, and to the sudden, aching idea that I might find out who loved me only if I didn't make it. The first time I truly understood that something was wrong, it wasn't because someone announced it, and it wasn't because I saw blood or felt a clean, obvious pain, because the body doesn't always give you a clear headline when it's in trouble, and hospitals don't always speak in sentences that patients can hold on to. It was a feeling of slipping, not falling, not fainting in a dramatic swoon, but slipping like your grip is slowly losing strength, like you're trying to hold onto the edge of a pool and your fingers keep sliding on wet tile, and you can't quite make them tighten again. I heard someone say my name close to my ear, and then heard it again, slightly louder, and I tried to answer, but my tongue felt thick and uncooperative, and my mouth was dry in a way that didn't match the amount of water I'd had. Because I hadn't had water, not really, not since the pre-op hours, and yet I felt thirsty in a desperate, cellular way, like my body was asking for something I couldn't give it. The pressure cuff kept squeezing, and every time it did, I felt a pulse of discomfort that went beyond annoyance, because it came with the subtle panic of repetition, the sense that they were checking and checking again because they didn't like what they were seeing. Then there were voices, more than one, overlapping in that careful hospital cadence where nobody wants to sound alarmed. But the tempo changes anyway, and I couldn't pick out full sentences, only fragments that floated in and out of my hearing like radio static. I felt hands on my arm, adjusting the foreline. I felt someone touch my forehead, quick and professional. I felt the bed move, or maybe it was my perception shifting, because the ceiling lights seemed to slide sideways as if the whole room was tilting. And then I felt cold. Not the normal cold of a hospital blanket that doesn't quite cover your shoulders, but a deeper cold that started in my core and spread outward. and it came with a heaviness in my limbs that made lifting a finger feel like lifting a brick. Have you ever been so tired that your body feels like it's made of sand? Like every movement costs you something you can't afford to spend? That's what it felt like, except it wasn't tiredness. It was my body stepping back from the surface of things, as if it was quietly turning down the lights. Someone said something about my blood pressure, and even though I didn't catch the exact numbers, the tone hit me, because numbers don't scare you as much as the way people react to them. And I heard a nurse call for someone, and the sound of her voice had that tight edge of focus that made my stomach drop. Then came the first real surge of fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you scream, because I couldn't have screamed if I wanted to, and it wasn't even the kind that makes you think incomplete thoughts, because my brain was already struggling to stay organized. It was a pure, animal fear, a recognition without language, like my body knew the truth before my mind had time to dress it up. Something is wrong. Something is wrong now. I tried to open my eyes wider, but the world stayed fuzzy, like looking through a film of water, and I heard the beep of the monitor change, not dramatically, but enough that someone stepped closer, and then someone else stepped closer, and suddenly there were too many people too near my bed for this to be normal. I remember the sound of gloves snapping on. I remember the squeak of shoes pivoting quickly. I remember someone pressing a stethoscope to my chest and telling me to take a breath, and my lungs obeyed, but it felt like breathing through something heavy. And then I remember a rolling motion again, the bed moving with purpose, the hallway sounds swelling and shifting as we passed through different spaces, and my mind tried to anchor itself by counting ceiling tiles. But even that felt impossible, because I couldn't keep the numbers straight. What scared me the most, in that moment, wasn't even the pain, because pain was there. Yes, a deep ache under my ribs that felt wrong and sharp in a way that made me clench my jaw, but pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing I couldn't control the narrative anymore. I couldn't manage anyone's emotions. I couldn't make a joke. I couldn't tidy the scene. I was just a body on a bed, and other people were making urgent decisions around it. They stopped somewhere, and I heard a door open, and the air changed, colder, cleaner, more sterile, and someone told me they needed to take me back, that there was bleeding, that they had to fix it, and even if I didn't understand every word, I understood that one. Bleeding. Inside. Fix it. Just picture that for a moment. Because it's one thing to imagine danger in a vague way, and it's another thing to hear professionals say a word that makes your mind flash to the simplest, oldest truth. Blood is supposed to stay inside you. And right then, I had a thought that surprised me with how small it was. I thought about my phone. Not because I wanted to scroll or distract myself, but because my phone was the tether to the people who were supposed to show up, and I realized I couldn't reach it, couldn't text, couldn't call, couldn't do anything that would keep me from being alone in the most important moment of my life. I remember the sensation of someone pushing medication into my fore, and the edges of the room softened, and my hearing became a tunnel, and the last thing I felt before I slid under again was the pressure of someone's hand on my shoulder, firm and grounding, like an anchor. And in that shrinking tunnel of awareness, my mind did something cruelly logical. It started taking inventory. My family knew I was having surgery. My family had my location. My family could have been here. And yet, in the rush of wheels and alarms and tightening voices, I didn't hear any familiar footsteps running down the hallway, and I didn't hear anyone saying my name the way people say it when they're afraid to lose you. I only heard machines and professionals and the sound of my own breathing turning thin. And as the darkness closed in, there was one thought that landed with a cold clarity I couldn't shake. If this goes wrong, I might die with nobody holding my hand. Coming out of consciousness isn't like waking from sleep, not after something like that, because sleep has softness and a sense of return, and this was more like surfacing through thick water, breaking into air in short, panicked gulps, then sinking again before I could fully understand where I was. I didn't have visions. There was no tunnel, no bright doorway, no neat message wrapped in mystery. There was only my mind, stripped down to essentials, working in fragments while my body did whatever it needed to do to stay alive. The beeping became a kind of metronome that my thoughts tried to match, as if keeping rhythm could keep me anchored, and the rest of the world came in through narrow cracks, snippets of nurses talking, the squeal of a curtain ring sliding, the click of plastic, the faint hiss of oxygen, all of it blending into a soundscape that felt both clinical and strangely intimate. because it was happening inches from my face while I couldn't move. Sometimes I knew I was in a hospital. Sometimes I felt like I was back in my apartment, staring at my ceiling, counting the small cracks in the paint. Sometimes I was neither place, just a floating awareness with a pulse of fear running through it like electricity. And the fear wasn't only about dying. When I first felt that something was truly wrong, fear wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the sudden, brutal clarity of how many things I'd never said because I assumed there would always be more time. It started with tiny memories, the kind you don't think matter until your life gets quiet enough to hear them. My mother's voice on a voicemail I'd listened to but never returned because I'd been busy and she sounded fine. My brother's birthday dinner I skipped because work was crazy and I told myself I'd make it up later. A friend's invitation I declined with a casual excuse because I didn't want to be tired the next day, because I valued my solitude so much that I treated connection like an optional subscription I could cancel whenever it felt inconvenient. Have you ever lived like that? Like love is something that will wait politely in the corner until you have room for it. In that inner haze, I kept returning to one thought, over and over, like my brain was pressing on a sore tooth. They're not here. At first it felt like a misunderstanding, like I was waiting for someone who didn't know yet, and my mind kept bargaining in the simplest ways, because bargaining doesn't always sound like prayers, sometimes it sounds like logic. Maybe nobody called them. Maybe the message didn't go through. Maybe they're on the way and stuck in traffic. Maybe the timing was bad. And then, like a blade turning slowly, another possibility cut through my excuses. What if they knew? What if they knew and still didn't come? The thought landed, and my body reacted to it in the only way it could, a pulse of panic that surged through my chest, making the monitor beat faster, making someone in the room move closer. I heard a nurse say something calming, felt a hand press gently against my arm, and even in my half-awareness I understood that my emotions were visible in my body, that my fear had a footprint. And the strangest part was that I didn't feel anger first. I felt embarrassment. Because I had built my whole identity on not needing anyone, on being fine, on being the easy one, the self-sufficient one, the one who never created drama. And now, at the edge of something terrifying, I wanted someone to want me enough to show up. Try to feel that for a moment, because it's a specific kind of pain when you realize you trained people not to worry about you, and now you're shocked that they aren't worried. In those looping half-dreams, I saw scenes from my life like they were being replayed in a quiet courtroom. Me waving off concern with a laugh. Me changing the subject when someone asked how I was really doing. Me taking pride in being the person who could handle anything alone. And then, in the same breath, I saw the cost of it. Distance had become my brand. Silence had become my language. And once you teach people that your walls are permanent, they stop knocking. I don't know how long I stayed in that in-between state, because time in ICU doesn't behave like real time, and sedation has a way of cutting the day into pieces you can't stitch together. But I remember one moment of clarity that felt like a hand closing around my heart. I heard a nurse on the phone, giving an update, speaking in that careful tone people use when the news matters, and I heard her say my name, then heard her pause as if listening. And even without hearing the other side of the call, I could sense the shape of it. I could sense that the person she was speaking to wasn't sprinting out the door. I could sense delay. I could sense hesitation. I could sense old resentments being weighed against urgency. And my mind, in its rawest honesty, whispered something I'd avoided for years. Maybe they love me, but not urgently. Maybe they care, but not in the way that makes you drop everything. Maybe my low maintenance life had taught them they could love me lightly and still be considered good family. What would you do if you realized, at your weakest moment, that the people you assumed would show up might not show up at all? In that question, something inside me shifted. Not into hatred, not into bitterness that would poison me, but into a clear, aching understanding. If I survived, I couldn't keep living as a person who performed fine while quietly starving for real presence. If I survived, I would have to tell the truth, even if it made people uncomfortable. If I survived, I would have to build a life where showing up wasn't a rare emergency event. Because I didn't want my last moments, if they had become my last moments, to be filled with machines and strangers and the hollow echo of an empty chair. When I woke up for real, the first thing I felt was thirst so intense it didn't even feel like thirst anymore. It felt like my whole body was asking for water in one unified scream, and I tried to swallow instinctively, then realized I couldn't, because there was something in my throat, something foreign that made every reflex feel wrong. My eyes opened to a ceiling I didn't recognize at first, pale and flat and too bright, and the lights seemed to hum, as if the room itself had a quiet electrical pulse. And I tried to turn my head, but my neck refused, heavy and stiff, like it belonged to someone else. I panicked, not loudly, not in a way anyone would call dramatic, but in a trapped, internal way, because the mind can stay rational right up until the moment the body won't cooperate, and then fear arrives like a flood. A nurse noticed, leaned in, and spoke to me in a calm, practiced rhythm, and I couldn't catch every word, but I caught enough to understand the basics. I was in ICU. I'd had a complication. They had taken me back in. I was stable now, and I needed to stay still. Stable. That word should have been comforting, but it also carried a shadow, because stable meant there had been a time I wasn't. I blinked slowly, trying to make sense of the room through the haze, and I became aware of the monitors, the tubing, the soft hiss of oxygen, the sticky pull of tape on my skin, and the strange pressure of the blanket tucked around me like a boundary. My hands felt puffy, unfamiliar, and I tried to lift one, but it moved only an inch, sluggish and weak, like my body was still negotiating with gravity. And then my eyes drifted, because the human mind does this even in shock. It searches for something familiar to prove you're still in the same life. There was a chair beside the bed. Empty. That emptiness hit me harder than the tube in my throat, harder than the ache in my abdomen, harder than the fact that I couldn't even clear my own throat without help. Because the chair wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a verdict. I stared at it, and a hot pressure built behind my eyes, because this was the moment I had rehearsed in my mind during that half-awareness, the moment where I would open my eyes and see someone, anyone, leaning forward with relief, and instead I saw nothing but plastic and silence. Just picture it for a moment, because it's not only loneliness, it's realization, and realization has weight. A nurse adjusted something near my arm, and I watched her hands, steady and capable, and I felt this strange gratitude that my life, in that moment, depended on strangers who took their job seriously. Then she asked me, gently, if I had family to call, and my throat tightened around the tube as if my body was offended by the question, and I couldn't answer out loud, so I stared, and she read my face like she'd done it 1,000 times. She told me they had notified the contact information on file, that messages had been left, that updates had been given. Notified. That word cut through the haze with sharp clarity. So it wasn't that they didn't know. They knew. The nurse didn't say anything cruel, and she didn't need to, because the truth was sitting there in the open like a cold plate on a table, and all I could do was lie there and absorb it. Hours passed in a strange, stretched way, and time became a series of small events. Someone checking my vitals, someone moistening my lips with a swab, someone asking me to squeeze their fingers, someone telling me I was doing well. And then, finally, I heard footsteps that sounded different. Not the soft efficiency of nurses, but the hesitant shuffle of people who don't know where to stand. My mother came in first, holding a small bag like it contained proof that she cared. My brother followed, eyes darting to the monitors and back to my face. Behind them was an aunt I hadn't spoken to in months, and I knew immediately that this wasn't a spontaneous rush of love. It was a group decision, a late arrival assembled out of obligation and discomfort. Their faces tried to form relief, but the relief looked rehearsed, like they'd practiced it in the hallway. They spoke softly, careful, and I couldn't speak back, so I listened, and all I could think was how strange it felt to be seen only after the danger had been handled, to be treated like a difficult meeting that had been postponed until it became unavoidable. Have you ever been so hurt that you don't even know what expression belongs on your face, because anger feels too loud and sadness feels too vulnerable, and all that's left is a quiet, stunned clarity? I lay there, watching them hover near the foot of my bed, and I realized something that made my chest ache more than the incision ever could. They didn't come because they couldn't. They came because it was finally late enough that showing up didn't require urgency. Recovery didn't feel like a triumphant comeback. It felt like learning to live inside a body I no longer trusted, while carrying a new awareness that made old habits impossible to return to, because once you see the truth in bright light, you can't go back to pretending the shadows aren't there. When I was moved out of ICU and into a regular room, the world got quieter, but the quiet didn't comfort me, because it gave my thoughts too much room, and I kept replaying the same small facts with the kind of obsession people reserve for heartbreak. They were notified. They waited. They arrived when the crisis had already passed its sharpest point. And every time my mind tried to soften it with excuses, another part of me, this new, raw part, refused, because I had spent too many years polishing reality into something easier to swallow. My family visited, but their visits had a shape. They came at convenient hours. They stayed for polite lengths of time. They brought items that looked good on a bedside table, and they spoke in the safe language of surface-level reassurance, as if emotion itself might contaminate the room. I watched it all with a clarity that felt almost unfair, because before, I would have accepted it gratefully, would have told myself it was enough, would have smiled and performed being okay so nobody had to sit in discomfort. Now I couldn't. Now my body had forced honesty into my life the way a storm forces you indoors. And the people who saved me, emotionally, weren't the ones I expected. A coworker named Nadia showed up on the second day with a cardigan for me because she knew hospitals ran cold, and she didn't make a speech about it. She just draped it over the chair and asked the nurse what I was allowed to drink. My neighbor, Mr. Ellis, the quiet older man who usually only waved in the hallway, walked in with a small container of soup he'd made because he didn't like the idea of me eating hospital food alone, and he stayed long enough to tell me a story about his own surgery years ago, like he was lending me courage without demanding anything back. And my best friend, Tessa, sat in the chair that had been empty, not scrolling on her phone, not trying to entertain me, just sitting there with steady presence, the kind that says, without words, that your fear has somewhere to land. Try to picture that difference for a moment, because it's not about grand gestures. It's about who treats your vulnerability as an inconvenience and who treats it as a responsibility. In the weeks after I went home, my independence looked different. I still paid my bills, still kept my routines, still handled my life. But I stopped using competence as armor, and that change made people react in surprising ways. Because when you stop pretending you're fine, you force the world to show you what it's actually willing to offer. I called my mother one afternoon and told her, calmly, that waking up alone in ICU had changed something in me, and that I couldn't keep doing relationships that only activated when it was convenient. She responded the way people respond when they feel accused but don't want to admit guilt, by bringing up the past, by reminding me that I was always distant, by saying I never asked for help, as if my silence had been a signed permission slip. And I listened, because part of me understood that she wasn't entirely wrong, but then I did something I'd never done before. I told the truth without apologizing for it. I told her that my low-maintenance persona had been a survival strategy, not a preference, and that love shouldn't require me to collapse before anyone shows up. I told my brother that I didn't want performative check-ins. I wanted real connection, even if it was awkward at first, and if he couldn't do that, I'd stop waiting for him to become someone he wasn't. Those conversations weren't dramatic. They didn't end with movie-style reconciliation. They ended with silence, with discomfort, with the sound of someone needing time to process. And in the past, I would have rushed to smooth it over, would have made a joke, would have taken it back. This time I didn't, because I had learned, in the most brutal way, that being easy to love can sometimes mean being easy to neglect. So I started building something else. I accepted help without turning it into a debt. I invited friends over even when my apartment wasn't perfect. I joined a small local community group that met for walks, not because I suddenly became extroverted, but because I wanted familiar faces in my life that weren't tied to obligation. And I practiced saying simple, honest sentences like they were a new skill. I'm scared sometimes. I don't want to do everything alone. I need you to show up. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to say those things when you've spent years proving you don't need them? I didn't forgive my family in some sweeping, sentimental way. I just stopped building my life around their limitations, and that, strangely, felt like peace. I used to think independence was the safest way to live, because if you didn't need much, you couldn't be disappointed much, and if you stayed emotionally light on your feet, nobody could really drop you, because you were never fully leaning in the first place. Then I almost died after a routine surgery, and I learned that the body doesn't care how capable you are, because it can pull the floor out from under you in a single afternoon, and when it does, you find out what your life is actually built on. Not your job title, not your productivity, not your reputation for being fine, You find out who shows up when you can't speak, when you can't reassure anyone, when you can't manage the story. And if that support feels thin, the lesson isn't to beg harder for scraps of attention, and it isn't to punish yourself for wanting to matter. It's to stop waiting for a crisis to prove your worth. It's to build relationships where showing up is normal, where love isn't delayed until it's convenient, where your presence is treated like something precious before it becomes something fragile. Just sit with that for a second and ask yourself, gently, who would be in the chair beside your bed if you couldn't ask anyone to come? And if the answer hurts, I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it because you still have time to change it. If you still have someone you care about, send the message, make the call, show up in the small ways that don't require emergencies. Because being loved, and having someone to love back, might be the rarest gift we get in this life. And it's too easy to realize that only when the machines are louder than the people.